Chapter 12. It was well past noon when the two riders approached the edge of the rim rocks breaking down into the river valley. It was hot, and they were dusty and tired and hungry. They had been riding for many hours through an uninspiring and forbidding landscape with scant vegetation and few water holes. The scattered cattle grazing along the way were gaunt and sad-eyed creatures. They had turned off the main road back at the forks indicated by the XL rider and thus had bypassed both the rec stage and the village of Hermosa. Pat Stevens pulled his horse up sharply when they reached the point where the road dipped over the rim rock. He woke the dozing Ezra with a loud whistle of surprise and pleasure. Ezra's horse stopped automatically, and the big man lifted his head and blinked his one good eye downward at the wide valley of the Katy ranch and shook his head disbelievingly at the spectacle of lush greenness stretching out in front and below them. "It can't be," he muttered angrily. "I'm dreaming, and we're back in Colorado. There ain't nothing like I'm seeing in the Big Bend of Texas." Pat grinned and said, "I don't blame you none for thinking you're dreaming, but you ain't, Ezra. That there's real. There's water and green grass down yonder. Look at our horses. They smell it all the way up here." "It's worth riding a long ways to look at that. What are we waiting up here for?" Pat began to roll a cigarette. "I just wanted to sit here and look at it. Kind of makes me feel good all over. And it don't look like it's even been grazed good. It's a downright shame to let grass like that go to waste." Pat nodded, licked a cigarette. "Sure is. I reckon that's the KT. Might be. Can't see the brands from up here, though. And the other side of the valley's the river, most likely. It's no wonder a gal running a ranch like this has trouble with rustling." A couple of riders appeared along the edge of the rim rock, coming down toward them at a trot. Pat's eyes narrowed as he turned to watch them. One of the riders appeared to be a girl. The other rider was tall and rangy. He held his horse close to the girl's and leaned towards her as they rode forward. "Let's ride down into the valley," Ezra muttered. "Looks like there might be a ranch at them trees in the middle. My belly sure could use some lining right now." He scowled at the approaching riders. "Can't you see that one of them's a gal? She'll want to stop and talk." Pat nodded slowly. "Yeah, she's a girl, all right." They were too far away from him yet to see Katy's face, but he knew it was she. It had to be. That graceful figure just naturally went with the picture Ben Thurston had shown him back at the Lazy Mare in the Powder Valley. The other rider drew a little away from the girl as they came closer. Sunlight glinted from the silver ornaments on his buckskin jacket and was reflecting from the ivory butt of his 6-gun carried in a holster turned forward on his left side. Lon Boxley frowned blackly at the two Powder Valley men as he reined up in front of them and demanded in an arrogant voice, "What you two waddies riding?" Pat didn't look at Boxley. He was studying Katy's face, fascinated to discover that she was prettier than he remembered Sally to ever have been. He wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. She looked back at him gravely, without seeming to resent his close inspection, and even smiled a little when he grew embarrassed and began to blush as he realized he was acting like a moonstruck fool. It was Ezra who answered Boxley. "Where we ride is our own business, mister." "I ain't so sure about that," Boxley said. Katy turned her eyes from Pat's and pleaded with her companion. "Don't go stirring up trouble, Lon. Not any more today. he insisted. We can't afford to take any chances, not with all the rustling lately. These hombres look like they wouldn't hesitate to run off a few head of stock if they got the chance. His jaw was swollen and purple. Dusty said, I reckon you're honing to show off your fancy draw. His hands were clasped loosely atop his saddle horns. His words were drawn, but they rang out coldly. Boxley looked him up and down, taking in Pat's careless posture and the crossed gun belts with low-tied holsters. Before he could reply, Kate put in sharply, You men quit acting like a couple strange dogs, growling at each other, showing your teeth. We don't care if you're heading for Brackor nor why. That's my ranch down below, but you're welcome to ride right across it to the ford. Pat lifted his hat and said, Then I reckon you be Miss Katy Rollins? Why, yes. She looked at him questioningly. Do I know you? What's it to you who she is? Boxley snapped. Pat paid no attention to him, but Ezra wheeled his horse around to put him close to the XL rancher. He had his gun half drawn, and he warned Boxley hoarsely. One more crack out of you will be your last. Don't, Katy cried desperately. She spurred her horse between the two men and said, You better ride back, Lon. And leave you here alone with these two gunmen? I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Her voice stamped its foot. As though there had been no interruption, Pat said, No, ma'am, you don't know me. I'm Pat Stevens from Colorado on a buying trip for heifers. They say you have some mighty fine stuff on the KT. I have. Her eyes shone happily. If you're interested in breeding stock. And then she hesitated, biting her underlip, and glanced aside at Lon. But I guess I haven't anything to sell, she ended lamely. Not ahead, he agreed. But I got some heifers if you're looking for buying some, he added to Pat. Why not come over to my ranch and talk it over? Pat was watching Katy. He saw her wince. She said to Lon in a low voice, I thought you planned to move your stock down on the KT. I know what I'm doing, he said, and to Pat, Well, how about it? No, thank you. Pat shook his head. If I can't make a deal for KT stuff, I guess I won't bother. Why don't you ride on across to Bronco? Katy put in bitterly. Half my stock is on the other side of the river anyway. You might get more of a bargain if you do that. Pat regarded her steadily for a moment. Maybe that's a good idea, ma'am. He reined his horse about and curtly said to Ezra, Let's go. They rode on down over the edge of the rim rock with their lead horse following him behind. There was a wooden gate at the foot of the cliff barring the cattle from going up the road and out to the valley. Pat swung off to open it, and as Ezra was riding through, he heard a horse coming down from above at a reckless speed. It was Katy. He held the gate open for her to ride through. She pulled up and said, Thank you. Her eyes were blazing with anger, and a red spot burned high up on each cheek, but her voice was steady. Pat closed the gate and swung upon his horse. Katy waited to ride between them, saying, If you'd like to stop at the ranch, I'll see if my cook can scare up something to eat. That'll be right welcome, Pat said, and Ezra echoed his feeling. We ain't et since last night in Marfa. I'll have to apologize for Mr. Boxley, Katy said, as though she had to force the words out. He's gotten into the habit of looking at all strangers with suspicion. I reckon that's natural in the Big Ben. Is he a neighbor of yours?
Yes, his ranch joins the KT. He's not always that way, but I guess you noticed his jaw.
Pat nodded gravely. Kinda looks like he run into something.
A man's fist, she told him with humor. In Hermosa this morning, another stranger. That's why he's so much on the prod about strangers.
He acts like a tough hombre.
He is. That's why he feels so badly about this morning. He not only got knocked on his back in front of me, but if I hadn't stopped it, the man would have killed him.
Pat said cheerfully. He was just trying to work off his peevy on us. That's all right, ma'am. We can handle his kind.
Did you say you're from Colorado?
She asked after they had ridden on a little ways in silence. That's right.
I wonder if you happen to know a town named Dutch Springs, she said impulsively. It's in the southern part of the state, I think, in a place called Powder Valley.
Let's see, Pat said, and looked coldly across at Ezra, who was making a strangling noise. Powder Valley, he mused. Ain't so far from where we're from. You know, Ezra? He looked over at the scar-faced man with a wink. You've been there, ain't you? Ezra nodded in bewilderment, not in the least understanding why Pat was acting so funny. Sure, he grunted, not more'n. Why do you ask? Pat interrupted him.
I was wondering if you might know a man there. His name is Ben Thurston. I was expecting him on the stage this morning, she went on in a low voice. The stage for Marfa that got holed up and the passenger killed.
Why, sure, Ezra began excitedly, but Pat cut him off again. We know old Tom Thurston, he told her. Seems like he did have a boy.
That's the one. Tom Thurston was his father. My father's old friend. I wrote him a letter a month ago asking him to come and help me on the KT, and he wrote back saying he'd be on this morning's stagecoach. And then it got held up and wrecked, and he was killed.
Why, no, Ezra put in strongly. I don't reckon he did, ma'am. Not less there was more than 2 passengers on that coach. She turned to look at him strangely.
There was only 1 passenger, and he was killed. Lon Boxley told me about it. He knew I was expecting Ben.
Her voice trailed off hopelessly. Must be some mistake, Ezra boomed before Pat could stop him. Must be Ben wasn't on the stage, 'cause we know a friend of ours that was on that stage and got on it in Marfa, don't we, Pat? Pat nodded cautiously. We know he got on the stage at Marfa. If there was only 1 fella killed, it must have been him.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Katy Rollins' face was radiant with newborn hope.
Perhaps he missed a connection and will be in tomorrow. You see, I gave up all hope when I heard about the accident, she went on. Oh, if only I'd kept that other man here. The 2 of them might have been able to do something, but I sent him away.
What other fella's that? Pat asked patiently.
The one who knocked Lon Boxley down in Hermosa this morning. He heard me say I needed some hands and he offered to hire out to me. It was mostly my fault, the fight I mean, she added honestly. He looked so funny in his striped shirt and city suit that I made the mistake of saying that I needed a man on the KT. And that's when he knocked Lon down to prove that his funny clothes didn't mean anything.
Wait a minute, Pat pleaded. I don't get the rights of this.
You think I'm crazy to tell it all to you, but I happen to think that you might see him if you ride over to Branco. That's where he went, I'm pretty sure. I left him at the ranch when I rode away with Lon, she went on to Pat's increasing bewilderment. I knew there'd be trouble if Lon found him there, so I rode away with Lon and left him. And if you see him in Branco, you might tell him I wish he'd come back now, because I've got another man coming, and the 2 of them can work together to stop the rustling. You understand, don't you?
Her dark eyes pleaded with him. Not quite, Pat admitted uncomfortably. No, ma'am, not altogether. This fella in the striped shirt and city clothes. What do he look like, and where did he come from?
He was young and handsome.
Katy blushed prettily.
Sort of tall, and he had eyes that looked right through you.
Pat set his teeth together firmly. He was recalling Ben Thurston's striped shirt and city suit, but he couldn't imagine any girl calling Ben handsome. Still in all, you never could tell about girls. Some of the ugliest men you'd ever known were married. But how had Ben gotten Hermosa? Where'd you say he was from?
I don't know. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell me much about himself. He walked into Hermosa, claiming his horse got snake bitten down the road a piece, and he claimed he had traded clothes with a man just for the fun of it.
Pat was further bewildered now. None of it made sense at all. There couldn't be two men dressed in the same way wandering around the Big Ben at the same time, but if it was Ben arriving on foot in some implicate manner, why hadn't he told the girl who he was? She was expecting him. It didn't sound like Ben Thurston to keep his name from her. Still, it didn't sound like the Ben Thurston he knew in Powder Valley either, to be knocking Lon Boxley down. He began to wonder if he had sadly underrated the young man. Maybe there was more to Tom Thurston's blood in the boy than he had given thought to. He could see Ezra's one eye glaring at him from beyond the girl who rode between them, and he knew that Ezra had finally added two and two together and made four out of her. That Ezra now realized he must have known about Ben Thurston's coming before he ever left Powder Valley. He was going to have some explaining to do when they got off to themselves. They were nearing the shaded ranch house under the spread of trees, and Katy told them,
"You must stop and eat before you ride on to Baracco, and I'll find out for sure if Dusty had ridden on."
"Dusty?" Both men choked out the single word in unison. Katy looked at them in surprise.
"That's what he said his name was, the rider I was telling you about."
Pat looked across at Ezra helplessly. "And you're saying he was wearing a striped shirt and city suit, ma'am?"
"That's right. What's the matter with you?"
"I don't know. I reckon maybe it's this here Texas sun. We ain't used to it. You feeling funny too, Ezra?" "I feel like I ate some loco weed," he went on tersely. "Well, that must be it, ma'am. I reckon we won't stop to eat. We'll just push on to the river."
"Nonsense, not in this hot sun if it affects you that way. You must stop and rest. You can go on to Baracco in the cool evening. You've got to remember, neither of you are young men anymore. I'm afraid the change of altitude is bad for you."
"Yes, ma'am," Pat agreed hollowly. "I reckon maybe it is." He didn't protest further. They stopped for Katy to dismount at the house and then took all 5 horses to the barn to turn them over to Miguel. End of chapter 12.